In this video, I want to talk about the concept of culture. Now, obviously, for anthropology, culture is a central topic. But if we're going to be talking about human cultures across the earth and also through time, we have to have a solid definition of what culture actually is. So we can first turn to this definition from Edward Tyler, who was a British anthropologist in the 1800s. He said that culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, arts, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. And it's this last part that's really important to us. Acquired by man as a member of society. So culture happens in groups. Culture is learned when a person exists within a group of people. Culture is transmitted from person to person and from generation to generation. Culture is not something we're born with. Our culture is not in our DNA. But there is a biological aspect to this, okay? There is an interdependent relationship that culture has with biology. And by that I mean that culture takes those biological things that make us human and it builds upon those. We can think about gender. Gender is based on something biological. But gender itself is not 100% biological. Sex is biological. We could also think about race. Race is, in theory, based on something physical about us, some physical characteristics. But the concept of race and how we apply that in our world, that's definitely cultural. Those are systems that have been invented by people living in groups. So there is a relationship between biology and culture, but culture is not purely dependent on biology. We can also ask the question, is culture purely human? Or do other animal groups have something that we could call culture? Now, a lot of people, when asked this question, would say, yeah, there are other animals that have culture. Maybe lions or dogs or some groups of birds. And this is a question that's hotly debated amongst anthropologists and biologists as well. We can certainly agree that other animal groups have particular behavior systems that they learn through other members of the group. Now, is that culture? Well, let's see at the end of the lecture today where we end up with that question. I don't think it's a purely cut and dry black and white issue, but I do think that we can agree that even if other animals do have culture, what we do as humans is so much more complex and so much more elaborated than any type of cultural behavior we see in any other animal. Lions, a fantastic group of animals, obviously some very complex behaviors there, but what we do really exceeds that of lions in terms of all the complex systems that we have developed. And where does it to be different or similar to each other is through this process of adaptation. Now, adaptation is a biological term, and we're borrowing it from biology here. But the definition of adaptation, an adaptation is a process by which an organism or humans cope with environmental forces and stresses. So adaptations are the ways that biological creatures, lions, penguins, us, whatever, adaptations are the ways that we deal with the world that we live in. It's the way that we respond to the things that our environment throws at us. So if we're thinking biologically, a biological adaptation might be a giraffe's long neck. Giraffes have very long necks so that they can reach leaves up high in the trees. That's a biological adaptation because it makes their life easier. It helps them survive. Similarly, the melanin in our skin. Melanin gives our skin its pigment. That's an adaptation. So we can see that people who live along the equator, who have ancestors who lived along the equator, have a higher concentration of melanin or more melanin-producing cells in their skin because melanin is a great natural sunscreen. And you need that if you're going to be living on a part of the earth where you get this really intense UV radiation. So those are both biological adaptations. But if we think culturally now, a cultural adaptation would be any of those things that we invent to make our lives easier. The wheel is a great example of a cultural adaptation. There existed a time in human prehistory when the wheel did not exist, when people had not yet come to the conclusion that rolling things would be easier than pushing them or carrying them. So the wheel was an invention that made life easier for the people who adopted it. Agriculture, farming. For most of our prehistory, humans were not farmers. We got all of our food from the wild. We hunted wild animals. We collected wild plant foods. But along the way, different human groups around the earth figured out that they were able to. Humans have fully elaborated cultures. And I would agree with that, to the point that only we have these extremely, extremely complex societies. So that's maybe pointing us in the direction of, yeah, we're doing something different from other animals, but we got to progress our definition a little bit more. This concept of society is really important for our understanding of culture, because societal living depends on every member of that society basically cooperating or working together to ensure this collective well-being and survival. And this is true of humans. It may not always feel like that. Certainly some days you read the news or even just get on the train and you think, we are not working as a cohesive whole here. But it is essentially true that human societies do work together to ensure that everyone makes it to the end. And this is based on a certain amount of predictable behavior. And by predictable behavior, I mean that for every interaction that we have with another human, we can expect a certain range of behavior from that individual. Or everything that we have to do in our day, we know, the limited range of possible outcomes for that activity. So, most of us take MTA every day, we take the subway, we take the bus. We understand that when we step onto the train is going to function in a certain way. And we expect that other people on the train are going to act in a certain way or comport themselves in a certain way. We know that the train will take us from point A to point B. We know that there's a conductor who is driving the train who will ensure that we get from point A to point B. So part of societal living is that everyone knows how to behave. Now, obviously, we don't always behave according to the rules, but we still behave within a sort of circumscribed set of possible behaviors. So in this sense, culture limits our behavior. It limits the things that we can do by setting up rules and setting up these sort of guidelines for how we are supposed to act in any given situation. The process by which we learn all of these rules, and essentially we learn our culture, is called enculturation. This is a really important word for us continuing throughout the semester. Enculturation is the process by which a child learns his or her culture. And enculturation does happen when we are kids. It happens through, when parents tell their children to sit up straight at the dinner table. We teach our children the rules of our culture by giving them direct instructions. But enculturation also happens sort of passively or without us even really trying it. Kids observe everything, absolutely everything. They soak in knowledge every single second of the day. And so a lot of that enculturation happens just through observation. Now, we talked before about how culture builds on biology. They have this interrelated relationship. But once again, there's no biological adaptability for any particular culture, meaning that you can be born in Argentina, but if you are raised as a young child in France, you will absorb the culture of France. Wherever you are raised, whatever culture you are brought up in, that is the culture you can learn. So the brain is not wired for one culture or another. We talk a lot about how, certain characteristics, it's in my blood, it's because this is how my people are, it's we have fire in our blood, whatever. That's, there's something to the idea that there's a history to certain characteristics, but it's not actually in our blood or in our DNA or in our brains. All of those rules that we come to learn come through interacting and observing other members of our culture. So let's hit each one of these points for our definition of culture, all these different characteristics of culture. The first of this is that culture is learned. And obviously I just said that. Enculturation is a process where we learn our culture. As humans, we have a really unique ability to learn, far beyond that of other animals. And that's because we have this really cool thing called language. Language is a system that's based on symbols to represent other ideas, right? I say a word and everyone knows what that word refers to. This makes learning so much easier because we don't have to have the direct object in front of us whenever we refer to something. So this learning process happens both consciously and unconsciously. And as I already mentioned, it happens through direct teaching, when we teach our kids how to tie their shoes, when we teach our kids to use one word over another. But it also happens through observation. Our kids watch us. They watch our reactions to certain situations. And this is how they learn what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's good and what's wrong according to the rules of that society. Culture is also something that is passed on from generation to generation. So when we are enculturated, or when our children are enculturated, we're learning the cultural systems of our parents. We're learning those cultural systems that came before. So while culture is always changing, it's not something that we have to invent with every new generation. We learn what has come before us, and then we build on that. Culture is also shared. And this should make sense if we're talking about culture existing within societies. So individuals, human individuals, all have culture. I can say I am a part of this culture, I have this certain culture, but it only happens within a group. So if you dropped a baby off on a desert island and somehow it managed to survive into adulthood, that baby, if it were all alone and there were no other humans around, that child would not have culture, because you have to get it in a group. And we learn our culture by interacting with all these different members of our society. So we learn our culture from our parents. We learn it from our peers, our friends. We learn it from our teachers. We learn it from the media. We learn it from absolutely everyone around us. Now, that being said, culture is not necessarily the same for every person within a group. If we were to say that there is such a thing as New York culture, it should be immediately obvious that not every person in New York interacts with New York culture in the same way or feels about it the same way. Not everyone in New York is going to have the same ideas about things, because we all experience our culture in different ways, based on all of these things that make us different, based on all of our personal life experiences, based on our gender, based on our ethnicity, based on the language we speak, on our religion, on our socioeconomic status. We all are going to perceive and interact with our culture differently, even if we're all living in this same shared culture. Culture is also all-encompassing. And by this I mean that culture pretty much includes everything. So yes, from that definition from Edward Tyler, from the beginning of this lecture, culture does include the knowledge, belief, arts, morals, laws, and customs, all of that. But culture is also our popular culture. It's the songs that we listen to on the radio. It's the crappy reality TV that we watch. Our culture is our technology. The phones that we use, the computers we use, the cars we drive. And think about how much our technology has been a force of change in culture over the last 20 years. I mean, if we think about iPhones, it's hard to walk into, if you go to bars, walk into a bar today, and every person at the bar is on their phone. No one talks to each other anymore. That's a huge change in cultural attitude and cultural behavior because of a small piece of technology. Culture is also about the ways that we talk and even how we walk. All right? I bet most of us don't think that how we walk is based on our culture. But it's true. If you go around the world and you look at different groups of people, you can see that there are differences in the way we handle our bodies, the way that we move our bodies through space. Or if you think about the question of personal space, some people stand closer together when they're talking. Some people maintain physical contact for longer when they're having a conversation with someone. All of these things are culturally based. And the way that we think about ourselves and our place in the world is also determined by culture. How important we see ourselves in the world, our status as a community member, all of this is determined by the rules and the guidelines set up by the cultures in which we're raised. Now, there's this great term, habitus, that was really championed by this anthropologist named Pierre Bourdieu. Habitus are all of those attitudes, skills, ways of acting that are learned as a part of everyday life within a culture. And when I say attitudes, skills, and ways of acting, this again comes down to the ways that we walk, the way that we sit in a chair, the way that you hold your knife, the way that you, line up for movie tickets. All of these little tiny things that seem so just minute and unimportant, but all of these little unimportant things are based on culture. We understand those from our culture. Culture is also integrated, meaning that it's a set of systems that are interwoven in some pretty complex ways. So if we want to talk about how a certain culture deals with gender, we can't just look at gender in a vacuum. We can't just say, all right, this culture has male and female, and this is how these two groups interact. Or this culture has male and female and a third gender, and this is how the three genders interact. We have to consider other elements of culture as well, like economics. What is the economic disparity between the genders, if it exists? Do women get paid as much for their labor as men? Do women occupy certain roles and men other roles? What about politics? Is there equal representation in political organization? What about race or ethnicity? How does that interplay with all of those other categories? We can see that all of these elements of culture are linked together, and when you start to change one aspect, the other aspects will also change. So if we consider the United States and, for example, gender, in the 1960s, 1970s, we start seeing women entering the workforce in greater numbers than they ever had before in the United States. Prior to that, many women led more domestic lives as housewives. But then as women were getting into the workforce, this had consequences for other areas of our culture. As women became more financially independent, you started to see changes in the family system. We start to see the divorce rate going up because women are no longer financially dependent on men. They have their own resources. We also see that economically, we see women becoming the major purchasers, the major drivers of consumerism. We see changes in political systems because of that movement of women into the workforce. So more women in politics. All of these things are linked together, and you can't change one part of the system without changing another. Culture and nature also interact in some pretty significant ways. And again, this is similar to the discussion of the relationship between culture and biology. Culture is not biological, but it builds off of biology. Culture tells us what to do with our biological needs, our biological urges. As biological creatures, we have a couple things that we have to do to stay alive and to remain a species. We have to eat, we have to eliminate waste, we have to keep ourselves sheltered from the elements, and we have to reproduce. Those are some basic biological things that we have to do as humans. But culture tells us how to do those things. So if we think about reproduction, biologically, to reproduce, there's really only one thing that we have to do. We have to have sex. Culture tells us when we should have sex, who we should have sex with, under what conditions we should have sex. Culture tells us you should be married before you have sex and have children, or you should be in this type of financial situation before you have children. But marriage is not a prerequisite for procreation, right? It's culture that tells us when and how we should do these certain things. And our culture also informs us on how we should feel about nature. In many parts of the industrialized Western world, we're very divorced from nature. We're very separated from the natural world. And so we tend to have a different relationship to it than, say, people who collect all of their food from the wild, like the San Bushmen who are pictured here. San Bushmen depend on nature to provide them all of their resources. So it's, pretty obvious that we're going to see a different type of relationship to nature and how people feel about it. Culture is adaptive at its root. As I mentioned before, adaptations are the things that develop over time in response to environmental stresses. So all of these cultural innovations, cultural adaptations, develop because humans have seen some sort of need and they're trying to solve some sort of problem. So culture is an adaptive system. However, culture is also maladaptive, meaning that there are downsides to culture. It's not always, every new invention isn't just rainbows and unicorns. There's going to be pitfalls along the way. And a good example of this would be the automobile. The automobile is a cultural adaptation, it's a cultural invention that was developed to move people from one place to another with greater ease and at greater speeds. When the car was first invented, it was like, sweet, look, I can go, 28 miles an hour. And it was a huge, turning point, obviously, in the United States and in the world at large. But no one, at the time of the invention of the automobile, no one was able to foresee, what would be going on now as a result of our reliance on the automobile. Things like massive pollution. A new phone came out tomorrow, and Apple said, right, you all can have this new phone, but you're going to have to kill 100,000 people a year to have it. We would say no. We would say there's no way. We're not going to sacrifice 100,000 people a year just to be able to have this piece of technology. But that's because, when it's put all right up front for you, then it's an obvious choice. But culture doesn't always give us the end result. We don't always know where we're going to end up when we first start out with new cultural adaptations. So we got to recognize culture has the good, and it's also got the bad associated with it. Culture is dynamic. This means that culture is always changing. It's really obvious to see in New York City how culture is always changing, but it's also always changing for every culture everywhere. And culture changes because of the individuals in that culture, pushing the envelope of those rules. So as we said, culture has all of these, bounding behaviors, things that you're allowed to do, things that you're not allowed to do. And we, as members of a culture, push against those boundaries and say, all right, I know I'm allowed to do this, but what if I do this? And as we push those boundaries, then it becomes perhaps more acceptable to push boundaries. And other people say, hey, I like the way that guy over there is pushing these boundaries. I want to push boundaries as well. And so in this way, there's a little bit of a struggle over whose definition of culture or whose boundaries will ultimately win out. The struggle doesn't have to be negative. It doesn't have to have a bad connotation to it. And sometimes we don't even realize that these boundaries are being pushed. But we change culture by constantly pushing at the previously existing norms. We can see this, we can see how culture is dynamic if we look at the role of women just in the last 100 years. During World War II, with lots of American men being shipped overseas to fight the war in Europe and then the war in the Pacific, that left a lot of jobs, and especially a lot of factories, munitions jobs, open in the United States. Jobs that needed to be filled to support the war effort. And so American women were called out, to do their patriotic duty and to work in these munitions factories to support the war effort. Great, women in the workforce, this is fantastic. But what happens as soon as the war is over? Okay? There are a certain number of ways that we can do it. Every time we make a choice to do something in one way versus another, that's an element of performance. And we're basically communicating to the people around us, I am making this choice to do culture in this way. We refer to this as agency. Agency is an individual's actions, both when they're alone and also when they're in groups, that recreates culture, that pushes culture forward, and ultimately transforms it. Okay, so when we push that envelope of acceptable behavior, That's us expressing our agency. Every single one of us has agency, and it's really important to recognize that we do perform our culture every single second of the day. Now, a second part of this performative aspect of culture, and one that's very important for us to remember, is that even though each individual within a culture has agency, we don't all have equal abilities to use that agency to transform culture. And this is referred to as practice theory. Okay, the relationship that the individual, us, the relationship we have with our agency to the culture that we exist within. So if we live in something called New York culture and we each have agency, we each have different motivations that guide us through life. We each have different goals for what we want our world to be, both our larger world, but also our individual personal worlds. We all have different agendas. And we also all have different degrees of power when it comes to asserting those agendas. So some people within our culture have more power, and therefore they have a greater ability to influence culture or change culture. Someone like Barack Obama, as the President of the United States, he has a lot of power to influence American culture and to influence world culture at that, because he is the president, because he has this platform. He has resources to further his own agenda. More power, we could say, than me, for example. And I understand this fact. Barack Obama has more power to change culture than I do, even though I still have agency and I still change culture in my own way through my everyday actions, just like you do. Okay, so practice theory understands that even though we all have agency, the ways that we use this agency and the power that we have to exert this agency differs within a group. Finally, culture is symbolic. And this is such a crucial point. This is really what sets us aside from other animals. Okay? Symbols are verbal and nonverbal signs that stand for something else. Language is a symbolic system. The word computer refers to this thing that I'm looking at now and that you're sitting in front of right now watching this video. But the word computer itself doesn't have any natural connection to this object. Instead, it is a set of sounds that we have designated to represent an object. Okay? As cultural beings, we use symbols, we use things to represent other things absolutely all the time. And language is the biggest way we see it, but we use symbols in lots of other ways as well. Every culture has its own symbols, and everyone within that culture understands those symbols. There are two really important elements to our definition of a symbol. Okay, symbols are arbitrary and they are conventional. When I say a symbol is arbitrary, I mean that there doesn't have to be a natural connection between the symbol and the thing it symbolizes. So again, the word computer doesn't have a natural connection to the thing that it is symbolizing. The word computer, it doesn't sound like a noise that a computer makes. It's just a word that we have associated now with this particular piece of machinery. But because we all use it, it becomes standardized as a matter of convention. So the second part of our definition is that symbols are conventional. Okay? They acquire their meaning through use within a group. All right? So those two elements, arbitrary and conventional, are really important for understanding what a symbol is. Lots of people have talked about symbols. I'm not going to ask you to remember each one of these people or their contributions to it, but I just wanted you to see some of the ways that people have been talking about symbols over the last 150 years or so. Ferdinand de Saussure was someone who originally was looking at symbols in terms of language. He said that words are a matter of signs or signified and signifiers. These representations of ideas or objects. Charles Peirce, another philosopher and scientist, he recognized different types of symbols. Then we get some more, strict anthropologists, Leslie White, who saw that symbols were the defining characteristic of culture. All right, so that symbols are what make a culture. And then Clifford Geertz, who says that that symbols, again, are what make it possible for us to do this complex thing called culture. And you're actually going to read a paper by Clifford Geertz for your first homework assignment that really is all about the symbolic relationship between a particular practice in society and then larger elements of that particular group. So symbols stand for something else. Language is pretty much purely symbolic. The word tree, for example, this word right here, it doesn't need to have any natural connection to this thing. But when we see this word, we know that everyone's talking about this. That's all a symbol is, all right? The word tree has nothing to do with the tree that we see outside, but because it's convention, we all understand that. Now we're going to be talking about symbols more as the semester continues. But just to wrap up this discussion of what is culture, I want to talk just a little bit about how we see cultural behaviors existing across the landscape, existing around the world. Because we can see when we look at different cultures that some people do things the same way and some people do things differently. And part of being an anthropologist is understanding why people do things in a certain way. So we can understand these patterns of culture or cultural behavior as one of three types: universal features, general features, or particular features. Okay, universal features are things that every human group does. An example of a universal feature of culture would be marriage. Every single human group on the planet practices some type of marriage. Okay? It is a cultural behavior that everyone does. A general feature is something that only certain groups do. So not everyone, but a good number. Monogamous marriage is something that a lot of groups practice, but not everyone. Monogamous marriage, meaning marriage between one man and one woman. A lot of people practice marriage in this way, but again, not everyone. And then particular features are things that are unique to certain groups. So only one group does that. And a particular feature, if we want to continue with this marriage feature, we can also see how these cultural traits, these cultural packages move from place to place over time. So diffusion is something that anthropologists have been interested in for a long time. How do these cultural practices move from place to place? Diffusion occurs when two or more groups come into contact. And there are three types of diffusion. The first is direct diffusion. And this is when some sort of cultural practice moves from one place to another because these groups are in contact through trade, through war, through intermarriage, some sort of sustained contact. We might think an example of this could be with food, all right? Food travels well between a lot of places. And let's think about specifically Mexican food. Everyone loves Mexican food. Mexican food obviously has its origins in Mexico, but we have tons of Mexican food in the United States. Why? Because of the connection between these two populations of people. So we see movement of people across international borders and then also movement of food. So that is an example of direct diffusion, where the United States has Mexican food because we have this close relationship with Mexico. Close geographic relationship, that is. A second type of diffusion is called forced diffusion, and this typically occurs in colonial settings, where you have one group of people coming into another area and saying, right, we're in charge now, so you're going to do things our way. Some really great examples of forced diffusion would be looking at religion or looking at language. The Spanish, when they first entered the New World, coming into Central America, coming into the Caribbean, coming into South America, they said, right, we speak Spanish and we're Catholic. So guess what? Y'all are going to speak Spanish and be Catholic. Because what are the consequences? Well, you can be Catholic or you can die. That's forced diffusion. When you're saying to another group of people, you will do this or else there are going to be significant consequences. Our final type of diffusion is indirect diffusion. And this is when some sort of cultural practice or behavior travels through some sort of intermediary from group A to group B and then group B to group C. So in this scenario, group A and group C don't have direct contact, but group B between them has moved that particular trait. And again, if we want to continue with, food, you can find Mexican food in Canada. Why? Well, we could say it's because it's moved through the United States. Now, obviously, today it's a lot easier to move people, from Mexico to Canada and completely bypass the United States, but we can still see this sort of, diffusion of traits through geographic space. The second way that we see cultural traits sort of develop or move is something that we call acculturation. Not enculturation, but acculturation. Acculturation happens as a result of continuous contact. Okay, so if you have two cultures that are consistently in contact with each other, they can each remain their own distinct cultures, but certain elements will develop or certain elements will change within each culture as a result of that contact. One example of this might be Spanglish. Okay, Spanglish is a particular form of speaking used by people who speak both Spanish and English. It is a result of contact between Spanish speakers and English speakers. And, it's the existence of the existence of Spanglish hasn't altered Spanish and it hasn't altered English, but it is this new form that has occurred as a result of continuous contact between these two language groups. Finally, we have what's called independent invention or independent innovation. And this is something that's important to remember, and sometimes anthropologists have a hard time remembering this is possible. But independent innovation is when we see two groups of people who do things in very similar ways. And in the past, it was the default for anthropologists to say, well, if two people are doing things in the same way, they must have had some sort of connection in the past. There must have been some sort of movement of people from one place to another. Because anthropologists thought that every invention had only been invented once and then spread out from there. But that's not entirely true. There are many examples where we see people in different parts of the world inventing the same thing or coming up with the same cultural practice. Because, again, cultural practices are adaptations. And so as long as you have similar environments or similar circumstances, then similar responses can be adapted. An example would be this great thing right here. It's called an atlatl. In Australia, it's called a woomera. It's a dart thrower, a spear thrower. And it's a way to hunt animals with greater efficiency, greater force. It's an absolutely fantastic piece of technology that's been invented several times in human prehistory. So the Australians invented it. The Aztec also invented this technology around 2,000 years ago or more. People living in Europe 40,000 years ago invented it. Indians living on the Great Plains invented it. Tons of different human communities have invented this same piece of technology without ever having been connected to each other. Pyramids are the same as well. We see pyramids in Egypt. We see pyramids in Mexico and Guatemala. That doesn't mean that Egyptians went to the Maya and said, let us show you how to make pyramids. It's that pyramids are a really good way to build something tall, and different groups of people came to that conclusion independently. So sometimes traits move between groups of people, and sometimes people just invent them themselves.